Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope all of you are in a good condition. So, in this occasion, I want to read my resume of structuralism and post-structuralism. Structuralism. Structuralism is a way of approaching texts and practices that is derived from the theoretical work of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. The first, Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure divides language into two component parts. He calls the first the signifier and the second the signified. He then goes on to argue that the relationship between signifier and signified is completely arbitrary. On the basis of this claim, he suggests that meaning is not the result of an essential correspondence between signifiers and signifieds. It is rather the result of difference and relationship. In other words, Saussure is a relational theory of language. Meaning is produced not through a one-to-one relation to things in the world, but by establishing difference. For example, mother has meaning in relation to father, daughter, son, etc. According to Saussure, meaning is also made in a process of combination and selection, horizontally along the syntagmatic axis and vertically along the paradigmatic axis. The meaning of the sentence is produced through a process of selection and combination. This is because the relationship between sign and referent is also conventional. It follows, therefore, that the language we speak does not simply reflect the material reality of the world. Rather, by providing us with a conceptual map with which to impose a certain order on what we see and experience, the language we speak plays a significant role in shaping what constitutes for us the reality of the material world. Structuralists argue that language organizes and constructs our sense of reality. Different languages, in effect, produce different mappings of the real. The way we conceptualize the world is ultimately dependent on the language we speak. And by analogy, it will depend on culture we inhabit. The meanings made possible by language are thus the result of the interplay of a network of relationships between combination and selection, similarity and difference. Meaning cannot be accounted for by reference to an extra linguistic reality. As Saussure insists, in language there are only differences without positive terms. Language has neither ideas nor sounds that exist before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system, our original emphasis. Saussure makes another distinction that has proved essential to the development of structuralism. This is the division of language into langue and parole. Langue refers to the system of language, the rules and conventions that organize it. Parole refers to the individual utterance, the individual use of language. Finally, Saussure distinguishes between two theoretical approaches to linguistics. The diachronic approach, which studies the historical development of a given language, and the synchronic approach, which studies a given language in one particular moment in time. He argues that in order to found a science of linguistics, it is necessary to adopt a synchronic approach. Structuralists have, generally speaking, taken the synchronic approach to the study of text or practices. They argue that in order to really understand a text or practice, it is necessary to focus exclusively on its structural properties. Structuralism takes two basic ideas from Saussure's work. First, a concern with the underlying relations of text and practices, the grammar that makes meaning possible. Second, the view that meaning is always the result of the interplay of relationships of selection and combination made possible by the underlying structure. In other words, text and practices are studied as analogous to language. The second, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Will Wright, and the American Western. Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1968, uses culture to help him discover the unconscious foundations of the culture of so-called primitive societies. He analyzes cooking, manners, modes of dress, aesthetic activity, and other forms of cultural and social practices as analogous to systems of language. Each, in its different way, is a mode of communication, a form of expression. In pursuit of his query, Levi-Strauss investigates a number of systems. It is, however, his analysis of myth that is of central interest to the student of popular culture. He claims that beneath the vast heterogeneity of myths, there can be discovered an homogeneous structure. In short, he argues the individual myths are examples of parallel articulation of an underlying structure all along. Myths. Levi-Strauss argues work like language. They comprise individual mythemes, analogous to individual units of language, morphemes and phonemes. Like morphemes and phonemes, mythemes take on meaning only when combined in particular patterns. He also observes that myths are structured in terms of binary oppositions. Drawing on Saussure, he sees meaning as a result of the interplay between a process of similarity and difference. Levi-Strauss claims that all myths have a similar structure. Moreover, he also claims that all myths have a similar socio-cultural function within society. Myths are stories we tell ourselves as a culture in order to banish contradictions and make the world understandable and therefore habitable. They attempt to put us at peace with ourselves and our existence. In Six Guns and Society, Willreich, 1975, uses Levi-Strauss' structuralist methodology to analyze the Hollywood Western. He argues that much of the narrative power of the Western is derived from its structure of binary oppositions. In short, while Levi-Strauss' primary concern is the structure of the human mind, Reich's focus is on the way the Western presents a symbolically simple but remarkably deep conceptualization of American social beliefs. He contends that the Western has evolved through three stages: classic, including a variation he calls vengeance, transition theme, and professional. Although according to Reich, the last transition theme Western was Johnny Guitar in 1954, it appears clear, using his own binary oppositions and narrative functions. The Dance with Wolves made in 1990 is a perfect example of the form. Reich, 1975, claims that each type of Western corresponds to a different moment in the recent economic development of the United States. The classic Western plot corresponds to the individualistic conception of society underlying a market economy. The vengeance plot is a variation that begins to reflect changes in the market economy. The professional plot reveals a new conception of society corresponding to the values and attitudes inherent in a planned corporate economy. Given the critical and financial success of Dance with Wolves, it may well represent a transition theme Western that marks the beginning of a reverse transition back to a time of less mercenary social and commodity values, back in fact to a time of society and community. The third, Roland Barthes, mythologist. Roland Barthes' early work on popular culture is concerned with the processes of signification, the mechanisms by which meanings are produced and put into circulation. Mythologist 1973 is a collection of essays on French popular culture. His guiding principle is always to interrogate the falsely obvious to make explicit what often remains implicit in the text and practices of popular culture. His purpose is political. His target is what he calls the gorgeous norm. In Elements of Semiology, Bardes' 1967 substitutes the more familiar terms denotation or primary signification and connotation or secondary signification. The first system or denotation becomes the plane of expression or signifier of the second system or connotation. The signifiers of connotation are made up of signs or signifiers and signifieds united of the denoted system. He claims that it is at a level of secondary signification or connotation that myth is produced for consumption. By myth, he means ideology understood as a body of ideas and practices, which, by actively promoting the values and interests of dominant groups in society, defend the prevailing structures of power. As Bardas explains, what allows the reader to consume myth innocently is that he does not see it as a semiological system, but as an inductive one. According to Bartas, semiology has taught us that myth has the task of giving an historical intention a natural justification and making contingency appear eternal. Now, this process is exactly that of Berja ideology. His argument is that myth is constituted by the loss of the historical quality of things. In it, things lose the memory that they once were made. It is what he calls the politic speech. Formerly, the image illustrated the text or made it clearer. Today, the text loads the image, burdening it with culture, moral, and imagination. In other words, image does not illustrate text. It is the text which amplifies the connotative potential of the image. He refers to this process as relay. The linguistic message works in two ways. It helps the reader to identify the denotative meaning of the image. Second, it limits the potential proliferation of the connotation of the image. What makes the move from denotation to connotation possible is the store of social knowledge or a cultural repertoire upon which the reader is able to draw when he or she reads the image. Without access to this shared code, conscious or unconscious, the operations of connotation will not be possible. And of course, such knowledge is always both historical and cultural. That is to say, it might differ from one culture to another, and from one historical moment to another. Post-structuralism. Post-structuralists reject the idea of an underlying structure upon which meaning can rest secure and guaranteed. What we call the meaning of a text is only ever a momentary stop in a continuing flow of interpretations following interpretations. The first, Jacques Derrida. Post-structuralism is virtually synonymous with the work of Jacques Derrida. Derrida adds to this the notion that meaning is also always deferred, never fully present, always both absent and present. Derrida, 1973, has invented a new word to describe the divided nature of the sign. Difference, meaning both to differ and to differ. Seizer's model of difference is spatial, in which meaning is made in the relations between signs that are locked together in a self-regulating structure. Derrida's model of difference, however, is both structural and temporal. Meaning depends on structural difference but also on temporal relations of before and after. For Derrida, the binary opposition, so important to structuralism, is never a simple structural relation. It is always a relation of power, in which one term is in a position of dominance with regard to the other. The second, discourse and power, Michael Foucault. One of the primary concerns of Michael Foucault is the relationship between knowledge and power, and how this relationship operates within discourses and discursive formations. Foucault's concept of discourse is similar to Althusser's idea of the problematic. That is, both are organized and organizing bodies of knowledge, with rules and regulations that govern particular practices, a way of speaking, thinking, and acting. Discourses work in three ways. They enable, they constrain, and they constitute. As Foucault 1989 explains, discourses are practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. He tracks the discourse of sexuality through a series of discursive domains: medicine, demography, psychiatry, pedagogy, social work, criminology, governmental. He argues that the different discourses on sexuality are not about sexuality. They actually constitute the reality of sexuality. Discourses are not once and for all subservient to power or rise up against it, any more than silences are. We must make allowances for the complex and unstable process whereby discourse can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also an hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. The last, the panoptic machine. The panopticon is a type of prison building designed by Jeremy Bentham in 1787. At the center of the building is a tower that allows the governor to observe all the prisoners in the surrounding cells without the prisoners knowing whether or not they are in fact being observed. According to Bentham, the panopticon is a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind, inequality hitherto without example, and that, to a degree, equally without example. In other words, inmates do not know whether or not they are actually being watched. Therefore, they learn to behave as if they are always being watched. This is the power of the panopticon. Panopticism is the extension of this system of surveillance to society as a whole. Bentham's panopticon is, therefore, profoundly symptomatic of a historical shift from the 18th century onwards in methods of social control. As Foucault explains, the panopticon is a generalizable model for defining power relations in terms of the everyday life. It is a diagram of mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. The increasing number of celebrity surveillance magazines such as Reveal, Pulsar, Head, and New work in a similar way. Celebrities are monitored and scrutinized, especially in terms of body size and sexual and social behavior, for our supposedly anonymous pleasure and entertainment. But again, the norms and standards that are used to criticize and ridicule celebrities are the same norms and standards that can be used to discipline us. The fact that we are on the other side of the screen does not mean that we are safe from the demand to conform or safely outside of the panoptic machine. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time and nice attention. I apologize if there are many mistakes. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.